The autumn sun was setting over downtown Atlanta when a young boy noticed an elderly woman standing nervously at the busy intersection of Pine and 4th Street. His mother had always taught him to be aware of others who might need help, and something about the way the woman clutched her grocery bags caught his attention. The boy, a 7th grader who had just finished basketball practice at the community center, adjusted his backpack and observed how the woman would step forward whenever the crossing signal turned white, only to retreat when cars zoomed past. Her silver hair gleamed in the fading sunlight, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her shopping bags. He had often walked this route home from school, knowing how intimidating this particular intersection could be even for younger people. 4 lanes of traffic converged here, and despite the crossing signals, drivers frequently rushed through, trying to beat the yellow light. The boy thought about his own grandmother and how she sometimes struggled with crossing busy streets. Making up his mind, he approached her with a warm smile. The woman reminded him of the kind librarian at his school, the one who always saved the best science books for him and remembered his favorite genres. She wore a neat floral dress and a light cardigan, her face lined with years of experience, but her eyes bright and alert. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, just as his parents had taught him. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" His voice was clear and confident, though inside he felt a small flutter of nervousness. Not everyone welcomed help from strangers these days, even well-meaning ones. The elderly woman turned to him, surprise and relief washing over her features. She had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, watching the steady stream of cars and growing increasingly anxious about crossing. Her arthritis was acting up today, making her usual independence feel a bit shakier than normal. "Oh, sweet child," she responded, her voice warm with gratitude. "That would be so kind of you." She adjusted her grip on her grocery bags, which were clearly heavy with her weekly shopping. The boy could see they contained fresh vegetables and what looked like a carton of eggs, probably supplies for home-cooked meals like his mother made. As they waited for the next crossing signal, the boy introduced himself properly, mentioning how he lived just a few blocks away and went to the local middle school. The woman smiled as she listened, clearly touched by his good manners and genuine desire to help. She shared that she had been shopping at Morton's Grocery, the family-owned store that had been a neighborhood fixture for over 40 years. The crossing signal changed to white, and the boy carefully positioned himself between the woman and the oncoming traffic. He remembered what his father had taught him about being a gentleman, to always walk on the traffic side of the sidewalk when accompanying someone. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crosswalk as they began their journey across the wide street. The boy matched his pace to the woman's careful steps, making sure she felt secure and unhurried. He noticed how she held onto her bags tightly, probably worried about dropping anything on the busy street. The crossing signal still showed plenty of time, its countdown numbers clearly visible against the black display. Around them, the city continued its usual afternoon bustle. A city bus rumbled past on the cross street, its brakes squealing slightly. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery on the corner, mixing with the crisp autumn air. A few leaves skittered across the pavement, carried by a gentle breeze that rustled through the young oak trees lining the sidewalk. Neither of them could have known that this simple act of kindness was about to spark an incident that would touch their community deeply. They were just 2 people, a young boy and an elderly woman, sharing a moment of human connection in a busy world that too often rushed past such opportunities for kindness. The boy was simply doing what felt right, what his parents and teachers had always encouraged, helping someone in need. He couldn't have predicted how this one decision would unfold into something much larger, something that would test his character and ultimately bring out the best and worst in those around him. As they approached the halfway point of the crossing, the atmosphere of the peaceful autumn afternoon was about to shift dramatically. The simple act of helping an elderly neighbor was about to become something far more complicated, revealing deep-seated prejudices that still lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly progressive city. Just as they reached the middle of the crosswalk, the first signs of trouble appeared. A bright red pickup truck came barreling down the street, its engine roaring louder than necessary for the residential area. The boy could see the driver's face twisted in impatience as he approached the intersection, even though the crossing signal still showed plenty of time. The elderly woman's hand tightened on the boy's arm as the truck drew closer. The boy instinctively moved to position himself more protectively between her and the oncoming vehicle. The groceries in her bags rustled with her nervous movement, the eggs she bought shifting precariously in their carton. "Don't worry, ma'am," the boy reassured her, speaking clearly but gently. "We have the right of way, and I've got you." His words seemed to steady her, though his own heart was beating a bit faster now. He'd been taught to be wary of aggressive drivers, having seen too many rush through crosswalks without proper care. The truck's brakes squealed as the driver was forced to stop, the vehicle halting just short of the crosswalk line. The sudden stop sent a slight burning smell of rubber into the air, mixing unpleasantly with the earlier sense of autumn and fresh bread. Other pedestrians on the sidewalk turned to look at the commotion, some shaking their heads at the driver's apparent recklessness. Through the truck's windshield, the boy could see the driver's face growing redder by the second. The man was probably in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap and what looked like a work shirt with a company logo. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white, and he was saying something, though the words were muffled by the closed windows. The elderly woman tried to hurry her steps, but the boy maintained their steady pace. "Take your time, ma'am," he said, remembering his mother's words about how rushing often led to accidents. "We're almost there." He could feel her trembling slightly, and he wondered if she was thinking about her own grandchildren in this moment. That's when the driver's window rolled down with an angry mechanical whir. The peaceful afternoon air was suddenly filled with the sound of an angry horn blast, followed by shouted words that made several nearby pedestrians gasp. The driver's voice was thick with an anger that seemed far too intense for such a minor delay. The boy felt his chest tighten at the words being hurled at them, but he kept his focus on helping the elderly woman reach the curb safely. His father had always told him that the best response to hatred was to show dignity and continue doing what's right. Still, he couldn't help but notice how the woman's face had fallen, her earlier grateful smile replaced by a look of distress and confusion. Other cars had stopped behind the red truck now, creating a small traffic backup. A few drivers humped their horns, though it wasn't clear if they were supporting the angry man or expressing frustration with his behavior. The crosswalk countdown continued its steady decrease, 12, 11, 10, though it felt like time had somehow both slowed down and sped up. The boy could hear people on the sidewalk ahead of them starting to talk among themselves. Some had pulled out their phones, either to record what was happening or perhaps to call for help. A young woman in a business suit stepped forward, looking ready to intervene if needed. The community was watching, and they weren't going to stay silent. Just 3 steps from the curb now, the boy heard the truck's door open with a metallic creak. The driver was getting out, still shouting, his voice getting clearer as he approached. The boy's instincts told him to hurry, but he maintained their steady pace, knowing that helping the elderly woman stay balanced and secure was the most important thing. As they finally reached the curb, the boy heard the distinct sound of someone dialing on a phone behind them. The angry driver's voice had taken on a different tone now. He was speaking to someone, describing what he claimed to be sitting in words that bore no resemblance to reality. The boy realized with a sinking feeling that the man was calling the police, twisting their simple act of kindness into something sinister. The peaceful autumn afternoon had transformed into something else entirely, and the simple act of helping someone cross the street was about to become a moment that would test not just one boy's character, but the character of an entire community. The elderly woman's face changed from confusion to anger as she realized what was happening. She straightened her back, still holding onto her grocery bags, and turned to face the approaching driver. Despite her earlier nervousness about crossing the street, there was nothing timid about her stance now. Years of life experience seemed to radiate from her as she prepared to defend the young boy who had shown her such kindness. "What do you think you're doing?" Her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the noise of traffic and murmuring onlookers. "This child is helping me cross the street. How dare you twist this into something ugly?" Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much injustice in her lifetime and wasn't about to stand for more. The truck driver, still on his phone, was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. His face had grown even redder, and he was describing a completely false scenario to the emergency dispatcher. "Yeah, I'm watching it right now," he said loudly, deliberately turning his back on the truth unfolding before him. "You need to send someone quick." More bystanders had gathered now. A man in a business suit stepped away from his morning coffee run to stand near the boy and the elderly woman. A mother with her young daughter moved closer, her hand protectively on her child's shoulder as she pulled out her phone to record. Two college students with backpacks paused their conversation to witness what was happening. The boy felt a mix of emotions he never experienced before. He was worried about the elderly woman beside him, angry at the injustice of the situation, and confused about how his simple act of kindness had sparked such hatred. But underneath it all, he felt a strange sort of strength growing, the kind that comes from knowing you're doing what's right, even when others try to make it seem wrong. "I recorded everything," called out a woman in exercise clothes who had been stretching nearby. "I got it all on video from the moment this young man offered to help." She held up her phone, her face set with determination. Others nodded, indicating they too had captured the truth of what happened. Traffic had begun to back up significantly now. Some drivers had gotten out of their cars to see what was causing the delay. The scene had drawn quite a crowd, with people gathering on both sides of the street. The autumn breeze carried snippets of conversation, words of support, expressions of outrage, and people calling out that they were witnesses to the boy's kindness. A shopkeeper from the corner store had come out to investigate the commotion. He quickly assessed the situation and approached the elderly woman. "Ma'am," he said gently, "would you like to come inside and sit down? We can put your groceries in the cooler until this is sorted out." His offer of sanctuary was a small but significant gesture of solidarity. The boy's heart was racing, but he remembered his mother's words about staying calm in difficult situations. He kept his voice steady as he spoke to the elderly woman. "Are you okay, ma'am? Do you need to rest?" His concern for her well-being remained his priority despite the chaos unfolding around them. In the distance, a police siren wailed, growing louder as it approached the intersection. The truck driver's face showed a flash of satisfaction, but it quickly faded as he looked around and realized just how many witnesses surrounded him. His false narrative was about to collide with the truth, backed by dozens of observers and multiple video recordings. The elderly woman reached into her grocery bag and pulled out a small business card. "I'm on the city's community board," she revealed, her voice firm and clear. "And I will not stand by while anyone tries to criminalize an act of kindness." Her words carried the weight of authority, and several onlookers nodded in approval. The atmosphere had shifted now. What the truck driver had intended as an intimidation tactic had instead brought out the best in the community. Strangers had become allies, united in their defense of truth and kindness. The boy noticed how people from all walks of life had stopped their daily routines to stand up for what was right. As the police car's lights became visible at the end of the street, the gathered crowd seemed to stand a little taller, a little closer together. This wasn't just about one boy helping an elderly woman cross the street anymore. It had become about a community refusing to let hatred win, about ordinary people choosing to stand up for what they knew was right. The police car pulled up smoothly to the curb, its lights flashing but siren now silent. Two officers stepped out, a veteran officer with gray at his temples and a younger officer who surveyed the scene with careful attention. They moved with practiced efficiency, but there was no aggression in their approach. They had clearly noticed the size and demeanor of the crowd. The truck driver immediately stepped forward, eager to tell his version of events. But before he could speak, multiple voices rose from the gathered crowd. "We have videos. I saw everything. That boy was helping her cross." The community's voice was unified, determined to ensure the truth was heard first. The senior officer raised his hand calmly, quieting the crowd. His eyes moved from the elderly woman, still standing dignified despite her trembling hands on her grocery bags, to the young boy who remained respectfully by her side, and finally to the truck driver whose face had begun to show the first signs of doubt. "One at a time, please," the officer said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of experience. "Ma'am," he addressed the elderly woman, "would you like to tell me what happened here?" His approach was professional but gentle, recognizing that she might still be shaken by the incident. The woman's voice was clear as she recounted the events, describing how the boy had politely offered his help, his careful attention to her safety during their crossing, and the truck driver's unexpected and unwarranted reaction. As she spoke, the younger officer took careful notes, while several bystanders nodded in confirmation. "I've been on the city's community board for 15 years," she continued, presenting her identification. "I know the difference between somebody trying to help and somebody trying to cause trouble. This young man," she gestured to the boy, "represents the very best of our community." The shopkeeper who had offered sanctuary stepped forward next. "I saw it all through my store window," he added. The boy was nothing but respectful. "It's all on my security cameras if you need to see it." More voices joined in, each adding their piece to the truth, while the truck driver's false narrative crumbled under the weight of eyewitness accounts. The woman in exercise clothes approached the officers, a phone ready to show her recording. "I caught everything on video from the moment he offered to help her cross." Other phones appeared from the crowd, each containing their own evidence of what had really happened. The younger officer spoke quietly to his partner, who nodded in agreement. They had seen situations like this before, but the overwhelming community response was notable. This wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about acknowledging and protecting the kind of community values that make a city worth living in. The boy watched as the truck driver's aggressive stance began to deflate. The man's earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his actions had not only been wrong, but had been witnessed by dozens of people. His false report had backfired, bringing the community together instead of dividing it. One of the college students spoke up, her voice carrying the passion of youth combined with education. "This is exactly what we've been studying in our social justice class. How assumptions and prejudices can make people try to criminalize simple acts of kindness. But look around, this is what community looks like when we stand together." The elderly woman's groceries had grown heavy, and the kind shopkeeper once again offered his store as a resting place. This time she accepted, but not before turning to the officers. "I want to press charges," she stated firmly. "Not for me, but for every young person who's ever had their kindness mistaken for something else. This has to stop." The senior officer nodded, understanding the deeper significance of her words. What had started as a simple crossing of the street had become a moment of community action, a stand against prejudice, and a demonstration of how everyday people could come together to protect what's right. As the officers began taking formal statements, the gathered crowd remained, standing witness to ensure justice would be properly served. The autumn sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the intersection where a small but significant change had just taken place in their community. Inside the corner store, the elderly woman sat on a chair the shopkeeper had quickly provided, her grocery bags safely stored in the cooler. The boy remained close by, still concerned for her well-being despite the chaos outside. The store's fluorescent lights cast a warm glow over the scene, creating a peaceful contrast to the commotion on the street. Through the store window, they could see the officers continuing their investigation. The truck driver's demeanor had completely changed now, his shoulders slumped, his voice barely audible as he spoke with the younger officer. The crowd outside had thinned slightly, but a core group of witnesses remained, ensuring their statements would be properly recorded. The elderly woman reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I need to call my daughter," she said, her hands still trembling slightly. "She's a lawyer, and she needs to know about this." Her voice carried both determination and a touch of weariness. The day's events had taken their toll, but her spirit remained unbroken. The boy's own phone buzzed. A text from his mother asking where he was. He hadn't realized how much time had passed since he'd first offered to help with the crossing. As he typed a brief explanation, the shopkeeper placed 2 cups of hot tea on the counter. "On the house," he said with a kind smile. "My mother always said tea helps in difficult moments." Outside, more police cars had arrived. The officers were speaking with each witness methodically, their notepads filling with consistent accounts of what had transpired. The woman in exercise clothes had sent her video to the police, and others were doing the same. Technology had become an ally of truth in this situation. A local news van pulled up to the curb, drawn by the unusual number of police cars and the gathering of people. A reporter stepped out, notebook in hand, but the senior officer kept them at a respectful distance. This story would be told, but not at the expense of proper procedure and the dignity of those involved. Back in the store, the elderly woman spoke softly to her daughter on the phone. "No, sweetheart, I'm fine. But this needs to be addressed properly." She looked at the boy with grandmotherly concern. This young man did everything right, and he deserves to know that the system can work the way it's supposed to. The shopkeeper had been busy calling some of his regular customers who worked at the courthouse. His quiet conversations in the background added another layer of community response. People who understood the law were being mobilized, ensuring this incident would receive proper attention. A gentle tap on the store's window drew their attention. The senior officer gestured that he needed to speak with them. Before going outside, the elderly woman turned to the boy. "You know," she said, her voice full of warmth, "what you did today. Offering to help me cross that street, that was a simple thing. But simple acts of kindness are what hold communities together. Don't let anyone make you afraid to be kind." The boy nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. His parents had always taught him to help others, and today had shown him why that lesson was so important. It wasn't just about crossing streets, it was about standing up for what's right, even when others try to make it seem wrong. As they stepped outside, they found the atmosphere had shifted again. The truck driver was signing papers, citations for filing a false report and disturbing the peace. His truck would be towed, as the investigation had revealed he was driving with an expired license. Justice was taking its course, methodical and proper. The gathered witnesses had formed a protective circle of sorts, their presence ensuring that the conclusion to this incident would be as public as its beginning. The college students were discussing plans to write about this for their campus newspaper. The woman in exercise clothes had already shared her video with local community groups. What had started as a simple act of kindness had transformed into something larger, a moment when a community chose to stand together against prejudice and fear. The intersection where it all began now felt different somehow, as if the evening sun illuminated not just a crossing point between streets, but a crossing point between what was and what could be. The elderly woman's daughter arrived at the scene just as the sun was setting, her legal briefcase in hand and determination in her step. She had already spoken with several colleagues on her drive over, and her arrival brought a new energy to the situation. She hugged her mother first, then turned to the boy with grateful eyes. "Thank you for helping my mother," she said warmly. "Now let me help make sure this situation is handled properly." She pulled out a business card from her wallet and handed it to the boy's parents, who had arrived moments earlier after receiving their son's text message about what happened. The news crew had set up their equipment at a respectful distance, interviewing some of the witnesses who felt comfortable sharing their perspectives. The woman in exercise clothes spoke eloquently about witnessing the entire incident from start to finish. The college students shared their thoughts about community responsibility and the importance of standing up against injustice. Inside the store, the shopkeeper had turned on his small television so everyone could watch the early evening news coverage. The story was leading the local broadcast, but not as a crime story. Instead, it was being reported as an example of community unity and standing up against false accusations. The boy's father placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder as they watched. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, but that's exactly why it's important." His mother nodded in agreement, her eyes reflecting both concern for what could have happened and pride in how her son had handled himself. The elderly woman's daughter was deep in conversation with the police officers, her legal training evident in her precise questions and careful documentation. She had already begun preparing a case that would address not just this incident, but the larger pattern it represented. This wouldn't be swept under the rug or dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally. The owner of a nearby restaurant sent over boxes of hot food for everyone who had stayed to give statements. People from neighboring businesses brought out chairs for those who had been standing for hours. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into an impromptu gathering of neighbors looking out for each other. The truck driver had been taken to the police station to complete his paperwork and face the consequences of his actions. His vehicle was being towed away, and with it went the physical reminder of how the incident had begun. But the memory of what had happened, and more importantly, how the community had responded, would remain. As evening settled in, the elderly woman's daughter suggested they all move their discussion to her office nearby. "We need to document everything properly," she explained. "This isn't just about one incident, it's about making sure it doesn't happen to someone else's child who stops to help their neighbor." The boy looked around at all the people who had come together, the shopkeeper who had offered shelter, the witnesses who had stayed to ensure justice was served, the officers who had handled the situation with professionalism, and his own parents who had taught him the values that led to his simple act of kindness. The news crew was packing up their equipment, but the reporter paused to share something encouraging. Other local stations had picked up the story, and social media was already spreading the message of how one community had stood together against prejudice. The incident was becoming a catalyst for important conversations across the city. The elderly woman's groceries were carefully retrieved from the store's cooler, and this time, several people offered to help carry them. She smiled at this show of support, but turned to the boy who had first offered his help. "Would you mind helping me one more time?" she asked warmly. "I think we should finish what we started." As they walked together toward her daughter's office, the boy realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. He had learned that while unkindness exists, it doesn't have to have the final word. The real story wasn't about one person's prejudice. It was about an entire community's courage to stand up for what's right. The law office was warm and welcoming, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle to facilitate conversation. The elderly woman's daughter had transformed the conference room into a space where everyone could share their experiences comfortably. Large windows overlooked the city streets below, where life continued its normal pace, unaware of the important discussions taking place above. The boy sat between his parents, watching as the lawyer organized the various witness statements and video recordings. On a large screen, she displayed a timeline of events, starting from the moment he had first offered to help. The woman in exercise clothes video played silently in the background, showing the truth of what had happened from multiple angles. "What we have here," the lawyer explained, "is more than just a single incident. We have an opportunity to create meaningful change." She spread out several papers on the table, police reports, witness statements, and printouts of the city's community guidelines. "But first, I want to hear from everyone about what this experience meant to them." The shopkeeper spoke first, describing how he'd witnessed similar incidents before, but had never seen such a strong community response. The college students shared their perspectives on how social media was already spreading the story, creating discussions about community responsibility and active bystander intervention. The elderly woman watched quietly as each person spoke, her hands folded in her lap. When it was her turn, her voice carried years of wisdom. "In my time on the community board," she said, "I've seen how small moments can lead to big changes, but only if we're brave enough to stand up and say this matters." Outside the office windows, the city lights began to twinkle as evening deepened into night. Someone had ordered pizza, and the smell of food reminded everyone that they'd been so caught up in events, they'd forgotten about dinner. As they shared slices, the conversation continued, moving from what had happened to what should happen next. The lawyer outlined several possible courses of action. "We can file formal complaints, push for community education programs, or work with local businesses to create safe spaces for people who need help." She looked at each person in turn. "But what matters most is that we use this moment to prevent similar incidents in the future." The boy's father, who had been quiet for much of the evening, spoke up. "My son did what we've always taught him to do, help others in need. No child should be afraid to show kindness because of how they might be perceived." His words resonated with everyone in the room, and several people nodded in agreement. The news coverage playing on a small office TV showed how the story was evolving. What had started as a local incident was gaining broader attention. Community leaders from other neighborhoods were calling in, sharing similar stories and discussing solutions. The conversation was growing beyond their single experience. As the lawyer took detailed notes, the elderly woman reached into her bag and pulled out something unexpected, a small photo album. "I've carried this for years," she explained, opening it to show pictures of community events from decades past. "Our neighborhood has always been stronger when we stand together. Today proved that hasn't changed." The boy listened as plans were made for community meetings, educational programs, and policy changes. But what caught his attention most was how the simple act of helping someone cross the street had rippled outward, touching so many lives and sparking important conversations. The woman in exercise clothes had been working on her phone, and now she shared what she'd discovered. "The video has gone viral," she announced. People are sharing their own stories of standing up against prejudice. We're not alone in this. Her words brought both comfort and responsibility. They were part of something larger than themselves. As the meeting continued, the boy noticed how every person in the room had played a crucial role in the day's events. The shopkeeper who provided sanctuary, the witnesses who stayed to testify, the lawyer who gave the incident its proper weight, and his own parents who had taught him the values that started it all. The elderly woman's daughter began wrapping up the meeting, organizing next steps and assigning responsibilities. But before they concluded, she turned to the boy with a gentle smile. "Sometimes," she said, "the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Never forget that." A week had passed since the incident at the crosswalk. The boy sat in his school's auditorium, surrounded by students and teachers who had gathered for a special assembly. The elderly woman sat in the front row, along with community leaders and local officials who had come to address the growing conversation about kindness and prejudice in their city. The school principal stood at the podium, describing how one student's simple act of helping someone cross the street had sparked a citywide movement. On a large screen behind her, images from that day played silently, not just the confrontation, but the moments of community unity that followed. The boy felt a mix of emotions seeing himself in those videos, still amazed at how events had unfolded. In the days following the incident, something remarkable had happened. People began sharing their own stories of times they'd hesitated to help others out of fear of misunderstanding. The elderly woman's daughter had compiled these stories, creating a powerful testimony to how prejudice affects daily acts of kindness. Local businesses had started putting up signs in their windows, "Kindness welcome here," and "Safe space for helping neighbors." The corner store where they had taken shelter that day had become a symbol of community support, with people deliberately stopping there to shop and share their own experiences. The woman in exercise clothes, who had captured the original video, stood up to speak. Her recording had now been viewed millions of times online, sparking discussions in communities far beyond their city. "What we witnessed that day," she explained, "wasn't just about one person helping another. It was about an entire community choosing to stand up for what's right." The college students who had witnessed everything had written an article for their university newspaper. Now they announced that other colleges were using their story to discuss active citizenship and community responsibility in their social justice classes. What had happened at one crosswalk was becoming a teaching moment across the country. The elderly woman rose to speak next, her voice strong and clear. She described how she had served on the community board for years, but had never seen such a powerful response to an incident of prejudice. "This young person," she said, gesturing to the boy, "showed us that the simplest act of kindness can be revolutionary when a community stands behind it." During the assembly, the mayor announced new initiatives inspired by what had happened. The city would be installing better lighting at crosswalks, creating community safety programs, and implementing education initiatives about prejudice and active bystander intervention. The incident had catalyzed changes that would benefit everyone. The shopkeeper, sitting with his family in the audience, had become something of a local hero for offering sanctuary that day. Other business owners were now following his example, training their staff on how to provide safe spaces for people facing harassment or discrimination. His small act of kindness had created a ripple effect throughout the business community. When it was the boy's turn to speak, he felt nervous but determined. His parents watched proudly as he approached the podium. "I just did what anyone should do," he began simply. "Help someone who needed it. I didn't think about anything else at the time. But now I understand that sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to people who try to make it seem wrong." The elderly woman's daughter then shared the legal outcomes. The truck driver had been required to attend community service and anti-bias training. But more importantly, his actions had led to new police protocols for handling similar situations and stronger consequences for filing false reports based on prejudice. As the assembly drew to a close, students began sharing their own stories of times that helped others or times they wished they had. The conversation was expanding, touching on deeper issues of community, courage, and connection. What had started as one boy helping one woman cross the street had opened up a citywide dialogue about the power of everyday kindness. The local news crews were there to capture it all, but this time they weren't just reporting on an incident. They were documenting a community's transformation, how one moment of confrontation had led to lasting positive change. The story had evolved from a single act of kindness into a movement for community unity and understanding. 1 month after the incident, the city held a special community celebration in the park near the famous crosswalk. Colorful banners hung between trees, and families gathered on blankets spread across the grass. The autumn leaves had turned golden, creating a perfect backdrop for what had become known as the Kindness in Action Festival. The boy and the elderly woman sat together at a table, sharing stories with people who came to meet them. She had brought her famous homemade cookies, the same recipe she'd been planning to bake the day of the incident. Now, she handed them out to children who gathered around to hear her tell the story of how one small act of kindness had changed their community. The corner store owner had set up a booth where people could record their own stories of helping others or being helped by strangers. These recordings would become part of a community archive, preserving the lessons learned for future generations. The line of people waiting to share their experiences stretched across the park. The woman in exercise clothes, whose video had started it all, had organized a group of volunteers who now helped elderly residents cross streets all over the city. They wore bright yellow vests with the words "Community Helper" printed on the back. What had begun as one boy's gesture had grown into an organized movement of neighbors helping neighbors. At the center of the park, a small ceremony was taking place. The city council had decided to install a new type of crosswalk signal, one with better lighting and emergency call buttons. But more importantly, they had added a plaque that read, "On this corner, our community chose kindness over fear. May this crossing always remind us of the power of helping others." The college students who had witnessed the original incident had turned their experience into a wider research project. They presented their findings at the festival, showing how small acts of kindness could create ripple effects of positive change throughout a community. Other universities had begun implementing similar studies in their sociology programs. Children from local schools performed a play they had written about the incident, but with a twist. Their version showed different scenarios where people could choose to help or turn away. After each scene, they asked the audience what they would do, turning a past event into lessons for the future. The elderly woman's daughter spoke about the legal changes that had resulted from that day. New protocols had been established for handling false reports, and sensitivity training had become mandatory for local businesses. But more importantly, people had become more willing to speak up when they witnessed injustice. In a quiet moment during the festival, the boy overheard 2 older men talking near the cookie table. One was saying how he'd always been hesitant to help strangers, worried about how his actions might be misinterpreted. But now, he said, "I realize that when a whole community stands together, there's nothing to fear in being kind." The local news crew was there again, but this time they were capturing images of unity and celebration. Children played together on the grass, elderly residents shared stories with teenagers, and people from all parts of the city mingled and talked about their hopes for the future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the boy and the elderly woman stood together near the new crosswalk signal. "You know," she said softly, "some people might say what happened that day was unfortunate. But I think it was exactly what our community needed, a reminder that when we stand together, kindness always wins." The festival continued into the evening, with lanterns being lit across the park. People had brought food to share, creating an impromptu community dinner. The simple act of breaking bread together seemed to reinforce the bonds that had grown stronger since that autumn day at the crosswalk. As families began to head home, carrying leftover cookies and new friendships, the boy realized something important. The story wasn't really about him, or even about what had happened that day at the crosswalk. It was about how a community had chosen to respond to prejudice with unity, to fear with courage, and to hatred with overwhelming kindness. The new crosswalk signal blinked steadily in the gathering dusk, its light a beacon of hope and reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can lead to the biggest changes, especially when a community decides to cross the street together.